Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The bread was still warm when Nora Vane tucked it under her coat. Her fingers were shaking, not from cold, though the November air in Greystone Pass had teeth sharp enough to draw blood. She was shaking because she knew what she was doing, knew the word for it, knew exactly what happened to people in this town when Aldous Prigg caught them in his store with something they hadn't paid for. The general store smelled of cedar and dried meat and the particular sour edge of a man who kept careful account of everything he owned. Nora had been standing at the bread shelf for 10 minutes before she took it, standing the way a person stands when they are fighting their own hands, telling themselves no, reminding themselves of their pride, their mother's voice, every lesson about honesty they had ever been given. Then she thought about her daughters. Wren, 7 years old, who had eaten nothing but watered oat broth for 3 days and had stopped asking for more because she had learned that asking made her mother's face do something terrible. And little Cass, 4 years old, who still believed everything would be all right, because 4-year-olds believe that, until the day they don't. Nora took the bread. She turned toward the door, and the shadow of Aldous Prigg fell across the floorboards in front of her, like a bar across a cell. Aldous Prigg was not a large man, but he had the quality of seeming large, the way certain dogs seem large when they plant their feet and lower their heads. He was 52 years old, with a complexion, the color of old tallow, and eyes that had been doing arithmetic on people for so long they had forgotten how to see anything else. He kept the only general store in Greystone Pass, which, in a mountain town cut off from the next settlement by 40 miles of switchback road, meant that Aldous Prigg had, over 20 years of careful management, made himself indispensable enough to be cruel. He saw everything. He remembered everything. He had a ledger that went back 17 years, and every debt in it was written in the same precise, unhurried hand. He looked at Nora Vane in his doorway, and he didn't raise his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. He said, "Put it on the counter." Just that. 3 words, the way a man says 3 words when he knows the 4 walls of the room and the 40 miles of mountain road are already doing the rest of his talking for him. Nora did not move immediately. She pressed the bread harder against her ribs, as if she could absorb it into herself, as if she could will it to disappear before his eyes found it. She could feel the warmth of it through her coat. She could feel the eyes of the 2 other customers in the store, Mrs. Callum from the milliner's and young Darcy Reed from the livery, both turned toward her with the frozen attention of people watching an accident that is already happening. She put it on the counter. She put it down with both hands, carefully, as if setting it down gently might matter. Her chin did not drop. That was the one thing she held on to through all of it. Her chin stayed level. Prigg picked up the bread, turned it over once in his tallow-pale hands, and set it back on the shelf with the deliberate care of a man restoring order to something that had been disturbed. Then he said, loudly enough for the whole store to hear, that Nora Vane's credit had been cut off 6 weeks prior for non-payment of her existing debt, that the debt now stood at $4.30, and that if she entered his establishment again before that debt was settled, he would speak to Sheriff Bowl about it. Mrs. Callum made a sound. Just a small one. Nora heard it like a wound. She turned and walked out of the store into the grey November air, with her coat still pressed to her ribs, and nothing under it now, and she walked 2 blocks to the end of the main street and stopped at the corner where the road turned toward the foothills, and she pressed her back against the wall of the feed barn and breathed. Just breathed. The mountains above Greystone Pass were white at the peaks and iron-grey below, and the wind came down off them with the smell of coming snow. She had no plan. She had no money. She had 2 daughters and 3 days of nothing left in the house. And then she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. Heavy boots, slow and deliberate, and a voice like cold gravel said, "How much do you owe him?" She turned. The man standing 6 feet away from her was not someone she recognized from town, which was strange because Nora Vane had lived in Greystone Pass for 4 years and knew every face in it. He was tall, not enormously so, but the kind of tall that comes with width and depth, the kind of tall that fills a doorway completely. Mid-40s, she guessed, though the weathering of him made certainty impossible. His hair was dark brown, going grey at the temples, long enough to touch his collar, and his beard was full and roughly kept. His coat was elk hide, worn smooth at the elbows and shoulders, with 2 large front pockets and a heavy collar he had turned up against the wind. His boots were the source of that sound, thick-soled, trail-hardened, the boots of a man who covers serious ground on foot. His eyes were the grey of the mountains above them, and they were looking at her without pity, which was oddly more bearable than pity would have been. He said again, quieter, "How much do you owe him?" Nora stared at him for a moment. Then she said, $4.30. He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had already calculated. Then he reached into the left pocket of his elk-hide coat and produced a worn leather pouch, and without another word he turned and walked back toward Aldous Prigg's store. Nora's mouth opened. She did not speak. She watched him go with the particular paralysis of someone who has been surprised so completely that their body has temporarily forgotten how to respond. She found out his name that evening from Harlan Cross at the livery, who knew everyone who came through the mountain passes. Gideon Delt, that was the name. He had been a trapper and a guide for 20 years in the range country north of Greystone Pass, working alone mostly, coming into town twice a year for supplies, and disappearing again into the high country that most people in town only saw from a careful distance. He owned no property in Greystone Pass. He had no family anyone knew of. He was the kind of man that small mountain towns accumulate as part of their landscape, present, peripheral, unremarkable, until the day he isn't. Harlan Cross told her that Delt had walked into Prigg's store, placed $4.30 on the counter in coin, and said nothing except that the debt belonged to the Vane account. Prigg had looked at the money for a long moment. Then he had taken it. Harlan said Prigg's expression during the transaction was the expression of a man who has won a hand of cards and then watched the other player refill his stack without showing any emotion about it. Nora sat with this information at her kitchen table that evening, while Wren and Cass ate the bread she had bought with the 2 cents she had found behind the flour tin. Not the bread from Prigg's. She couldn't have touched that bread now, but a smaller loaf from the baker's widow, 2 streets over, who sometimes sold day-old at a mercy price. She sat and thought about a man in an elk-hide coat who had asked how much without asking why. She thought this was either the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years, or the beginning of something she did not yet understand. Gideon Delt had come down from the high country 3 days before Nora Vane took the bread, driven not by any social inclination, but by the most practical of reasons. His winter supply of rendered fat had been raided by a black bear in September, and he had not had time before first snow to replace it. He needed lard, dried beans, cartridges for his Remington, and a new awl for leather work, and then he intended to be back above the tree line before the serious cold settled in. He had not planned to spend $4.30 on a stranger's debt. He had not planned to stay in Greystone Pass past Thursday, but he had been standing at the end of the alley beside Prigg's store when Nora came out, and he had watched her press her back against the feed barn wall, and the particular quality of her stillness, not the stillness of shame, but the stillness of a person making calculations about survival, had stopped him in a way that theatrical distress would not have. He had seen people cry in the street and kept walking. There was something about the absence of crying, the level chin, the purely practical effort to breathe and think, that made him stop. He was not a sentimental man. He had not been sentimental since the age of 19, when sentiment had cost him the only thing he had ever lost that actually mattered. But he was a precise man, precise about what things cost and what they were worth. And what he had seen in that alley was something worth more than $4.30. Greystone Pass itself was the kind of mountain town that had been established with ambition and then slowly narrowed by reality. It had started as a mining camp in the silver rush of the 1860s, grown briefly into something with a newspaper and a hotel and 3 competing saloons, and then watched the silver give out and the population reduce itself to the people who had nowhere better to go, and the people who had decided that a hard place with clean air and clear water was preferable to an easier place that asked more complicated things of a person. What remained was a population of around 300, a single church, a school that met 3 days a week, the general store, a livery, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the dentist, a saloon that had eaten the other 2, and a particular social hierarchy that had calcified around money and length of residence in the way that isolated communities often do, with the entrenched looking down at the newcomers, and the newcomers working twice as hard to be half as visible. Nora Vane was a newcomer of 4 years, which in Greystone Pass still qualified. She had arrived with a husband named Thomas, who had worked the secondary silver claims with 2 partners, found nothing in 18 months of work, drunk himself through the earnings, and then one morning in the spring of the 2nd year, simply not come home. Not dead. She had confirmed this, eventually through a letter from a sheriff in a Nevada town where he had been briefly jailed for a bar fight. Just gone. She had stayed because she had no money to leave, and because Greystone Pass, for all its hardness, had a school for Wren and a doctor within reach of Cass's winter coughs, and because leaving required a decision about where to go, and she was already using all her decision-making on how to stay. Gideon Delt knew almost none of this when he paid Nora's debt. He knew the number, $4.30. He knew the object, a loaf of bread. He knew the look on Prigg's face when he took the money, which was the look of a man who had been about to enjoy something and had been interrupted. He knew his own reaction to that look, which was not righteous indignation, but a cooler, more practical distaste. The same distaste he felt for traps set too close to water, for hunters who took more than they could carry, for any system that confused power with right. He spent the 2 nights after the transaction in the back room of the livery that Harlan Cross rented to travelers at 15 cents a night, and he went about his business, acquiring his supplies, sharpening his tools, treating a small cut on his left hand that had opened in the cold, with the methodical self-sufficiency of a man who has been alone long enough to have solved most of the problems that come from being alone. He did not seek Nora out. He did not consider what he had done a beginning of anything. He had seen a number he could cover, and he had covered it. That was the complete account in his mind. He planned to leave on Friday, He told himself this on Wednesday evening, sitting in the livery's back room, with his Remington cleaned and his packs restocked, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He told himself this on Thursday morning, when Harlan Cross mentioned, making conversation, that the Vane widow, Harlan called her a widow, which was not accurate but was, the town's preferred simplification, had 2 small daughters and a leaking roof, and had been cutting her own wood since August. The roof mattered because snow was coming. Anyone who had spent a winter in the Greystone Range knew the signs. The particular yellow tinge of the cloud cover on the western peaks, the behavior of the ravens who had been moving to lower ground since Monday, the smell of the wind which had gone from sharp to something heavier and more deliberate, the kind of smell that in the high country meant you had perhaps 36 hours before the world turned white and stayed that way. Gideon Delt knew this the way he knew most things about weather and terrain, not from instruments or almanacs, but from a lifetime of paying attention to the information the world offers freely to anyone patient enough to read it. He knew that a leaking roof before a serious mountain snowfall was not an inconvenience. It was a danger, slow and cold and grinding, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply wears a person and a household down until something breaks that cannot be repaired. He did not make a decision exactly. It was more that he failed to make the decision to leave, which in a man of his particular discipline amounted to the same thing as choosing to stay. He asked Harlan Cross for the location of the Vane house. Harlan told him with the expression of a man trying very hard not to make anything of it, which meant he was already making quite a lot of it. Gideon collected his tools from his pack, selected the ones relevant to roof work, and walked up the hill. The house was at the upper edge of the residential quarter, where the town lots ran out and the mountain began its serious climb. It was a 2-room structure. No, 2 rooms and a lean-to, built of pine board and river stone, functional and honestly made, though it had been some years since anyone had given it serious maintenance. The roof showed the problem immediately. Several shingles on the north face had shifted or split, and the ridge beam above the main room had developed a sag that told him water had been getting in since at least last spring. Nora was in the yard when he arrived, splitting wood with an axe she held correctly, but without the wrist rotation that would have made the work easier on her arms. She saw him coming up the track, and she stopped mid-swing and held the axe at her side and waited, which he found appropriate. He said, "Your roof won't hold a heavy snow." She said, "I know." He said, "I can fix it." She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that were. He registered this without dwelling on it. The particular dark brown of pine bark in the rain, watchful and direct. She said, "Why?" He set down his tools on the woodpile. He said, "Because the snow's coming tonight." He picked up a spare axe leaning against the woodpile, tested its weight, and began splitting the wood she'd been working on with the wrist rotation she hadn't been using. She watched him for a moment. Then she went inside to check on her daughters. That was the beginning. Neither of them called it that at the time. But that was what it was. He had the worst of the roof repaired by mid-afternoon, working in the thickening cold with the focus of a man for whom physical problems in cold weather are simply conditions to be managed. Nora brought him coffee at noon, real coffee, not the chicory substitute most of the town had gone to, and he understood from the quality of it that she had used something she was rationing, which told him something about how she operated, that confirmed the impression the alley had already given him. He drank it standing on the roof and said nothing about it, and she went back inside. And that was the whole of their interaction until he came down at 3 o'clock and told her The ridge beam needed a more permanent repair in the spring when the weather allowed, but that it would hold. "What was coming tonight?" She said. "What do I owe you?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "I don't take things for nothing." He looked at her with those grey mountain eyes and said, "You didn't take anything. I put it where it needed to be." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "Then I'll put a meal where it needs to be. Come back at 6. He almost said no. The refusal was already in his mouth. The habitual self-sufficiency of a man who had not eaten at another person's table in longer than he could easily calculate. But there was something in the offer that was not charity and not performance, and he recognized it because it was the same quality his own gesture had carried. Practical, even. A transaction of the only currency either of them appeared to trust. Useful action, cleanly offered, without debt attached. The snow arrived at 8 that evening, as he had calculated, heavy and purposeful, the first real snow of the winter that meant business. He was not at Nora's table at 8 because he had arrived at 6 and stayed, not through any conscious social decision, but because Wren, who was 7 and had apparently decided within 10 minutes of his arrival that she had questions that needed answering, had engaged him in a conversation about how he found directions in the high country without roads, and he had answered her with the same directness he would have brought to an adult, using the real terminology, the real methods, not softening it for her age. And she had responded to this with the focused, rapid-fire questioning of a child who has been underestimated by adults long enough to be genuinely startled when one doesn't. Cass, who was 4 and operating on the simpler algorithm of small children, had climbed onto the bench beside him at dinner without asking, and sat against his arm the whole meal with the trusting weightlessness of a child who has not yet learned to be cautious about people, which he found. And this surprised him, not intrusive but oddly steadying, like ballast. Nora watched all of this from the other side of the table with an expression he could not fully read, which was also not something he was accustomed to. Most things he could read. Most people he could read. She was doing something more careful with her face than most people bothered to do, and he found himself paying attention to it in a way that was purely observational, but also, he admitted to himself later, slightly more than that. What the town said about Gideon Delt staying in Greystone Pass past Friday was various and immediate, and most of it was wrong in the specific ways that small-town speculation is always wrong. Accurate about the surface fact, and completely mistaken about the interior truth. The surface fact was that he had fixed a widow's roof and then been seen at her house 2 more times in the following week, once delivering a haunch of venison he had taken on a day hunt in the lower foothills, and once sitting on her porch in the late afternoon with a cup of coffee and apparently no particular agenda, which in Greystone Pass constituted a social event of some significance. The interior truth was considerably less dramatic. He was staying because the secondary snow he had expected had arrived, and then stayed, closing the upper passes 3 weeks earlier than usual, making his return to the high country genuinely inadvisable, even by his own unfussy standards. He had seen 3 experienced mountain men come to grief on early closure passes, and had no interest in becoming a 4th. He was staying because the practical arithmetic of his situation required it. He told himself this every evening in the livery's back room with perfect conviction. He also brought Nora Vane a haunch of venison, which was not required by any arithmetic he chose to examine closely. Aldous Prigg noticed, as Aldous Prigg noticed everything in Greystone Pass that might have commercial or social consequence. He noticed that the mountain man had taken an interest in the Vane woman's household, and he turned this information over in his mind, the way he turned coins over, assessing it for what it might be worth, what leverage it might represent, what use could be made of it at the right moment. Prigg's interest in Nora Vane had been consistent and uncomplicated since her husband left. She owed him money and had no reliable way to pay it, which placed her in a category of people he found useful in the specific way that a man finds useful those who cannot afford to be his enemy. He had not been cruel to her in any dramatic way. He was too careful for drama. But he had maintained the debt with a precision that kept her permanently within reach of real difficulty. The $4.30 that Gideon Delt had paid had closed that particular account, which irritated Prigg in the way that a cleared debt always irritates a man who prefers his leverage living. He had already identified 2 other items on the Vane account, a bolt of winter fabric from October and a bottle of cough medicine for the younger girl from November, that together came to $1.80. He intended to make sure these were remembered. He had not yet decided when or how to use them, but a man like Prigg was patient. He kept his ledger current, and he waited. Wren Vane had a habit of watching from the window. She had developed it in the 18 months since her father stopped coming home, and it had calcified into something automatic, a sentinel behavior, a child's response to the discovery that the world could change without warning, and that watching at least gave you the advantage of seeing the change before it arrived at the door. She watched Gideon Delt from the window on the mornings he passed the house on his way from the livery to wherever the day's work took him. She noted that he walked the same way her mother stood in difficulty. Not defeated, not performing, just moving through the world as if it were a problem to be navigated rather than a force to be endured. She noted that he always looked up at their roof when he passed, the quick assessing glance of someone who has taken professional responsibility for a structure and continues to monitor it. She noted that he brought the venison without being asked and set it on the porch without ceremony, and that when her mother offered to pay him for it, he said it would have otherwise gone to the ravens, which was the kind of thing a person says when they want to give something without making the receiver feel the weight of receiving. Wren was 7 years old, and she had learned more about the behavior of people under pressure than most adults twice her age. She thought Gideon Delt was the most honest person she had seen in Greystone Pass. She had not decided yet whether that made him safe or simply more precisely dangerous than the dishonest ones. The letter arrived from the Nevada Sheriff's Office on the second Tuesday in December, forwarded through 3 postal relays, and opened, Nora was nearly certain, before it reached her. The seal had been repressed with a care that wasn't quite perfect, and in Greystone Pass there was only one person with both the access and the motivation to read other people's mail. The letter confirmed what she had suspected for 2 years. Thomas Vane was alive, working a freight operation out of a town called Dustfield, and had married a woman named Clara Bett in October, which meant, by the law of the territory, that Nora Vane was not a widow. She was a wife with an absent and bigamous husband, which was a legal and social position considerably more complicated than widowhood in an 1880s mountain town. She sat with the letter at the kitchen table for a long time after the girls were in bed. She thought about what it changed. Nothing practical, which was the first thing. Thomas's absence had been absolute for over 2 years and would remain so regardless of what a Nevada clerk had recorded. The girls had no memory of him that was worth anything. But the legal reality of it, that she was neither free nor properly provided for, that she existed in a gap between categories, was one more piece of weight added to a load she had been carrying without complaint and without putting down. She folded the letter and placed it in the tin box under the floorboard beside her bed, where she kept the girls' birth documents and what remained of the money from selling Thomas's tools. She did not tell anyone about it. Not that evening. She told Gideon 3 days later, not because she had decided to, but because he asked a direct question, and she found she could not produce a lie fast enough to meet the quality of his attention. He had come to the porch to check the roof drainage after a melt and refreeze cycle, and she had brought coffee, and they had been standing at the rail looking at the snow-covered street below when, he said without particular emphasis, the letter from Nevada. Was it bad news or complicated news? She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the street. She said, "How did you know about a letter?" He said, "Prigg mentioned it to Harlan, which means he read it." She absorbed this for a moment, the confirmation of what she had suspected, and also the information that Prigg was already moving the pieces. She told Gideon the content of the letter in 2 sentences, plainly, without the self-pity that the situation might have justified. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Does it change anything you're doing day to day?" She said, "No." He said, "Then we'll deal with it if it becomes a problem that needs dealing with." It was not a romantic statement. It was not a declaration of anything except a practical partnership of the kind that severe weather and difficult circumstances sometimes produce between people who would not otherwise have had reason to stand at the same railing. Nora heard it, however, as something slightly larger than its words, and she did not correct this hearing, which was a choice she made quietly and without ceremony. Prigg moved in January, as she had known he would, as Gideon had predicted he would, without knowing Prigg's specific timeline. He did not move dramatically. Drama was not his instrument. He moved through channels. He spoke to Sheriff Bowl about the Vane account, citing the outstanding $80 as a matter of community record. And in the same conversation he mentioned, with the practiced casualness of a man who has rehearsed his casualness, that the situation at the Vane household had become somewhat irregular, given the presence of an unmarried man of no fixed address spending time at the property of a woman whose marital status was, as he understood it, ambiguous. Sheriff Bowl was not a bad man, but he was a man who depended on Prigg's store for his own credit line, and who had the law enforcement instincts of someone who preferred social clarity to complicated justice. He went to see Nora on a Wednesday morning, hat in hand, apologetic in manner, and asked her to clarify both the debt and the question of her marital situation. Nora told him the truth about Thomas, which was that he had abandoned his family, that she had legal evidence of his subsequent bigamous marriage, and that by any reasonable interpretation, she was a woman alone raising 2 children. Bowl nodded. He wrote it down. He went away. But the conversation had happened publicly enough that, by Wednesday evening, Greystone Pass knew about Thomas Vane's Nevada wife, which meant it also knew about the ambiguity, which meant Prigg had gotten exactly the leverage he came for. The town's response was divided in the way that small-town responses to female difficulty always divided. A sympathetic majority who expressed their sympathy privately and did nothing, a vocal minority who felt that clarity of social category was important for the health of the community, and a small number of people who were simply waiting to see what happened next, because a story was more interesting than an opinion. Into this landscape, Gideon Delt made no public statement and no visible change in his behavior. He continued to do what he had been doing: useful work, honest presence, a venison delivery when he had it, a check on the roof drainage when the weather cycled. He did not disappear from Nora's porch, which some people had expected him to do once the social complication became visible, and he did not declare anything that would have given Prigg the satisfaction of a clean narrative to work against. He simply continued, which was in its own way a statement, though not the kind that gave anyone a handle to grab. Prigg watched this from his store window, with the patience of a man who has several moves remaining and is in no hurry to use them. He had the $1.80. He had the sheriff's ear. He had 17 years of knowing how a mountain town worked. What he did not have, and had not yet accounted for, was the particular quality of Gideon Delt's attention, the way it moved like weather, slow and total, seeing everything, missing nothing, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has spent 20 years in high country, where the difference between a good decision and a bad one is whether you rushed it. It was Wren who found the second letter. She was not snooping. She was looking for a button that had rolled under the floorboard near her mother's bed, and when she lifted the loose board, she found the tin box. And because she was 7, and the instinct to understand things was stronger than the instinct to leave them alone, she opened it. The Nevada letter she could not fully read. Her literacy was good, but the formal legal language was beyond her current range. But she found something else in the tin box that her mother had apparently not placed there herself, because it was not in her mother's handwriting, and it was not folded the way her mother folded things. It was a small piece of paper, plain and unaddressed, on which someone had written in a precise commercial hand, "The debt is not cleared. The arrangement is not acceptable. There are other instruments." She did not know what it meant exactly, but she knew the handwriting. She had seen it on the credit receipts her mother sometimes brought home from the store, on the notices posted in the window, on the sign above the door. She put the button in her pocket and the paper back in the box and replaced the floorboard and went to sit at the kitchen table and think about what she had found and what it meant and what, if anything, to do about it. She was 7 years old. She thought about it with the seriousness of someone considerably older, because that is what happens to children when the world makes early withdrawals on their innocence. Wren showed Gideon the note on a Thursday afternoon when her mother was at the schoolhouse meeting with Wren's teacher about the spring term fees. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 4 days, the paper worn soft at the folds from handling, turning it over in her fingers the way she had seen her mother turn problems, working the edges until the shape of the thing became clear. She did not show it to her mother, because she had calculated, with the practical intelligence of a child who has learned to think 2 steps ahead, that showing it to her mother would produce worry, and her mother was already at the limit of what worry she could carry, without it showing in ways that frightened Cass. She showed it to Gideon because he was the person in her current world least likely to be frightened by a threat, and most likely to know what to do about one. He read it once. He turned it over, looked at the back, turned it to the light from the window. He asked her where she found it. She told him the truth, including the part about the loose floorboard and the tin box, and he listened without the adult instinct to scold her for the discovery, which she appreciated. Then he folded the note carefully and placed it in his vest pocket, and said, "You did the right thing," she said. "What does it mean?" He said, "It means Prigg put something in your mother's house without her knowing, which means he had someone in this house, and it means he plans to use it as a reason to pressure her." He said this plainly, as he had told her about navigation, using the real words. She nodded. She said, "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to find out exactly what instruments he thinks he has, and then I'm going to make sure none of them work." The instrument, as it turned out, was the property itself. Gideon Delt spent 2 days in the county records office, a cold, underlit room at the back of the sheriff's building, staffed by a clerk named Finch, who was meticulous and incorruptible, the latter quality being the more relevant, and what he found in those 2 days reframed the entire situation in a way he had not anticipated. The land on which Nora's house stood had been leased by Thomas Vane from the town's land administration at the time of their arrival 4 years prior. The lease was annual. Thomas Vane had paid the first 2 years. The third and fourth years, since his disappearance, had not been paid. The arrears on the lease now amounted to $6, which under the terms of the original agreement gave the land administration the right to reclaim the property with 30 days' notice. The land administration in Greystone Pass was, in practical terms, a committee of 3, the mayor, the sheriff, and the town's primary commercial landowner. That last position was held by Aldous Prigg. Gideon sat with this information in the records room until Finch politely indicated it was closing time, and then he walked out into the January dark and stood in the street and looked at the mountains above town, white and absolute in the moonlight, and thought about the architecture of what Prigg had built. It was not dramatic. It was not illegal. It was simply a system of interlocking pressures, each one individually manageable, but collectively designed to close around a person like a winter, gradually, from every direction, until they had nowhere left to stand. He went to see the mayor, a man named Aldrich Webb, the following morning. Webb was a reasonable man in the limited sense of being responsive to reasoned arguments when those arguments came attached to something he valued, which in his case was the appearance of fairness. Gideon laid out the facts: the lease arrears, Prigg's position on the committee, the note found in Nora's house, without embellishment and without visible anger, in the same tone he would have used to describe trail conditions to a fellow traveler. Webb listened with the uncomfortable attentiveness of a man who is realizing he may be implicated in something he did not design, but has been enabling. He said, "The lease arrears are a matter of record." Gideon said, $6 is a matter of arithmetic. I'll pay the arrears today. Webb said, "That doesn't address the committee process." Gideon said, "No, but it removes the legal ground Prigg is standing on, which means any further action he takes will be visible for what it is." Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Prigg won't like this." Gideon said, "No." He said it with the calm of a man for whom other people's preferences about outcomes have never been a significant planning consideration. Webb looked down at his desk. He said, "Come back this afternoon with the $6, and I'll process the lease transfer into the widow's name directly." He paused, or whatever her correct legal designation is. Gideon said, "Her correct legal designation is a woman who has been here 4 years and is not leaving." He paid the $6 that afternoon. Prigg found out about the lease transfer the same day, as he found out about most things in Greystone Pass, immediately and through channels he had spent years cultivating. His response was visible only to those who knew what to look for: a slight increase in the precision of his movements behind the store counter, a tightening around the eyes, the quality of stillness that precedes a decision rather than following one. He was not afraid of Gideon Delt. He had dealt with difficult men before, men with reputations, men with resources, men who thought that physical presence constituted power. What he had not dealt with, or not recently, was a man who operated in the same register he did, patient, methodical, unseduced by the desire for dramatic confrontation. It was like looking into a mirror that showed an unfamiliar face, and it unsettled him in a way he did not care to examine closely. He counted his remaining instruments, the $1.80 on the Vane account, which was legitimate debt, the sheriff's ear, which was reliable but not unconditional, the social ambiguity of Nora's marital status, which he had seeded effectively, but which was losing potency as the town grew accustomed to the situation. And one other thing, something he had not yet deployed, something he had been keeping for exactly this kind of impasse. He went to his back room that evening and opened his older ledger, the one that went back to the first year of his store, and he found the page he was looking for and read it carefully, and something that might have been satisfaction if it hadn't been so cold moved across his face. Nora found out about the lease transfer from Webb himself, who stopped her on the street on Friday morning with the slightly guilty energy of a man delivering good news he doesn't entirely feel he deserves credit for. She stood on the frozen main street of Greystone Pass and listened to him explain that the lease on her property had been cleared and transferred into her name, and she felt the particular complicated sensation of someone receiving help they didn't ask for in circumstances where they hadn't known they needed it. She was not weak. She had never been weak, but she had been alone for 2 years with 2 children and a leaking roof and a ledger at Prigg's store that had functioned like a hand around her throat, and the sudden loosening of one of those pressures produced in her not relief exactly, but a kind of raw exposure, the feeling of a wound uncovered that has been bandaged so long you had forgotten the original injury. She thanked Webb. She walked home. She found Gideon splitting wood in the yard. He had taken over the wood supply entirely at some point, without either of them formally noting this transition, and she stood at the yard gate and looked at him for a long moment. He kept splitting wood. He did not look up. She said, "You paid the lease?" He said, $6. She said, "That's not nothing." He set down the axe and looked at her, and for the first time in their entire acquaintance, she saw something on his face that was not purely instrumental. Something that was, she realized, the same thing she had been keeping carefully behind her own face for several weeks. He said, "No, it's not nothing." He picked up the axe. She went inside. But the air between them had changed, and both of them felt it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The thing in Prigg's old ledger was this. 22 years ago, in the second year of the store's existence, a trapper named Harlan Delt, Gideon's father, as the town's longer memories confirmed, had taken credit for a winter's supply of goods amounting to $11 against the collateral of his trapping rights on a stretch of Mountain Creek that he registered with the store as a lien guarantee. Harlan Delt had died the following spring of a fever, before the debt was settled. The debt had technically passed to his estate, which consisted of a teenage son and a mountain cabin. Prigg had never collected on it, not because he was generous, but because the son had disappeared into the high country at 17, and the cabin was too remote to be worth the legal effort. But the debt existed in the ledger, compounding at 3% annually for 22 years, which by Prigg's calculation had grown to something in the region of $20. Whether this debt was legally collectible after 22 years of silence was a question for a lawyer, and there was no lawyer in Greystone Pass. Whether it constituted a moral claim on Gideon Delt was a question of a different kind. Whether Prigg intended to use it as a weapon, regardless of its legal standing, was not a question at all. He brought it to Sheriff Bowl on a Monday, framed as a matter of unsettled town commerce, and Bowl, tired, compromised, genuinely unsure of the right thing to do, told Prigg he would raise it with Delt directly, as a courtesy before taking any formal action. Bowl came to the livery on Tuesday morning, with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man delivering a message he didn't write and doesn't believe in. He laid it out plainly, because he was, at his core, an honest man operating under uncomfortable pressures, the old debt, Prigg's claim, the question of what Gideon intended to do about it. Gideon listened without expression, as he listened to most things. Then he asked to see the ledger entry. Bowles said he didn't have it. It was Prigg's ledger. Gideon said he would need to see it before he could respond to any claim. Bowles said that was reasonable. He went to Prigg and told him Delt wanted to see the entry. Prigg brought the ledger to the sheriff's office that afternoon, a performance of cooperation that was itself a calculated move. The ledger open to the correct page, the entry clear and dated, and in his precise hand. Gideon looked at the entry for a long time. He looked at the date. He looked at the amount. He looked at the description of the collateral. Trapping rights on Cutter's Creek, registered as a lien guarantee. Then he said, "The trapping rights on Cutter's Creek were registered with the Territorial Land Office in 1861, 2 years before this entry. They can't be collateralized on a store debt without the Land Office's involvement." Prigg said, "That's a technicality." Gideon said, "Everything you do is a technicality. The question is, which ones hold?" He closed the ledger and pushed it back across the sheriff's desk. He said, "I'll write to the Territorial Land Office this week. If the lien is valid, I'll settle the debt in full. If it isn't, we're done here." His voice was the same temperature it always was. Prigg looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his ledger and left. What changed in Greystone Pass after that Tuesday was subtle, but real. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but that everyone in a small town feels in the way they feel a change in the wind before the weather arrives. The story of the ledger entry moved through the community in the way stories move in small places, altered slightly at each retelling, but retaining its essential shape, which was the shape of a man reaching back 22 years to use a dead father's debt as a club. The town's sympathies, which had been cautiously distributed, began to consolidate. Not dramatically. Prigg still held the supply monopoly, and nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of their only source of flour and cartridges through a mountain winter. But the consolidation was real. Mrs. Callum, who had made that small sound in the store the day Nora took the bread, began buying small items from the baker's widow rather than from Prigg when the widow had them. Harlan Cross started directing his out-of-town travelers to Gideon for guide and supply advice, rather than to the store. The doctor, a quiet man named Fells who had been in Greystone Pass for 15 years and had his own history with Prigg's ledger, stopped by the livery one afternoon and said to Gideon without preamble, "If you need a character witness for anything legal, I'm available." Gideon thanked him. These were small things, but they were the small things from which larger things are built. Nora did not know about the ledger confrontation until Wren told her. Wren, who had been listening from the alcove outside the sheriff's office, where she had gone to return a book to Finch the clerk, and who had heard the whole exchange through the thin plank wall. Nora received this information at the kitchen table, with her coffee cup in both hands, and the expression of a woman recalculating a situation she thought she had already calculated. She had known, in a general way, that Gideon was moving pieces on her behalf: the roof, the venison, the lease, the wood. She had accepted these because they carried no debt, no performance, no implicit claim on her future. What she had not fully appreciated until this moment was the scale of the architecture he had been quietly dismantling, the interconnected system of pressures Prigg had built, and the patience and precision with which Gideon was taking it apart. She thought about the note in the tin box, the one Wren had found, and she thought about what it meant that Prigg had gotten someone into her house, and she thought about the 22-year-old ledger entry, and she thought about all the ways in which a person could be surrounded without ever being touched, closed in without a door being locked, controlled without a hand being raised. She had been surviving inside that system for 4 years, making adjustments, managing, staying upright. She had not known what it would feel like to have someone dismantle it from the outside. It felt, she decided, like the first breath after a long time underwater, necessary and a little bit frightening in its fullness. Cass asked Gideon at dinner on Wednesday whether he was going to stay. Just like that, in the direct and unguarded way of 4-year-olds for whom the question that needs asking is simply asked. Gideon looked at her across the table. Small Cass with her mother's dark eyes, and her father's stubborn chin and a piece of bread in each hand, and he said, "I don't know yet." Cass considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she said, "You should." Wren from across the table said nothing, but she watched Gideon's face with the particular attention she brought to important things. Nora at the stove kept her back turned. Gideon said, "Why?" Cass said, "Because the wood needs splitting, and you do it right." This was not an incorrect analysis. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a reasonable argument." Cass nodded and returned to her bread, satisfied. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the January dark pressed against the glass, and the mountain cold was total. And the town of Greystone Pass sat under its snow, with its ledgers and its histories and its careful hierarchies. And inside the small house at the top of the hill, a man who had been alone for 20 years sat at a table with 2 children, and a woman who had not asked for any of it, and felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a moment to identify it. It was the particular warmth of a place that has begun, quietly and without ceremony, to feel like it might be his. The Territorial Land Office reply arrived in February, and it said exactly what Gideon had argued it would say. The trapping rights on Cutter's Creek had been registered under the Delt family claim in 1861 and could not be subsequently collateralized without Land Office involvement, which had never occurred. The debt, as Prigg had structured it, was not legally enforceable. Gideon read the letter in the livery, folded it, and placed it in his coat. He felt no particular triumph. He had known this was the likely outcome from the moment he saw the ledger entry, which was why he had asked to see it before responding to any claim. What he felt was the satisfaction of a calculated move arriving at its expected conclusion, which was a different and quieter thing than triumph. He brought a copy to Sheriff Bowle that afternoon. Bowle read it and said, "I'll inform Prigg." His tone had shifted. The compromised, uncomfortable quality had diminished, replaced by something slightly straighter. The Land Office letter was not Bowle's absolution, but it was a clear line that moved him from the difficult middle ground of genuine legal ambiguity onto solid footing. He was a man who preferred solid footing, and he felt its return with the relief of someone who has been standing at the edge of something for too long. He went to Prigg's store and informed him of the Land Office ruling. Prigg received it with the immaculate composure of a man who has been in business long enough to absorb setbacks without showing them. He nodded. He thanked Bowle. He watched him leave. Then he went to his back room and sat with his ledger and his thoughts for a long time. Prigg's remaining instrument was the $1.80, and he was precise enough about the law to know that a legitimate store debt was a legitimate store debt, regardless of how it was being used. He was also precise enough about people to know that his position in Greystone Pass had shifted, not collapsed, not critically damaged, but shifted in the way that a wall shifts when one of its foundational stones is removed. The town was watching him differently. Not with hostility, they still needed his store, and he still held their credit lines, and a mountain winter was not the time to make enemies of your supply chain. But with a new awareness, the particular awareness that a community develops when it has seen, behind a familiar face, and found something it recognizes, but had been choosing not to name. He was not finished. A man like Prig was not finished by one lost legal argument and a changed social temperature. But he was recalculating, and recalculation takes time, and time was the one resource he had always had more of than his opponents. He opened the store the next morning at his regular hour, arranged his shelves with his regular precision, and served his customers with his regular courtesy. If anything in his manner had changed, it was a quality almost too subtle to name: the faint recalibration of a man who has decided that patience is not just his strategy, but his only remaining path. The second Nevada letter arrived in the same week as the land office reply, and this one was addressed not to Nora, but to Sheriff Bowl, from a Nevada county magistrate who had been contacted, as best as anyone could determine, by Thomas Vane's new wife, Clara, who had apparently discovered the existence of a first family and had engaged a lawyer. The letter requested confirmation of Thomas Vane's original marriage to Nora, his abandonment of the family, and the current circumstances of the wife and children in Greystone Pass, as relevant to a legal proceeding Clara Bette Vane intended to bring regarding the validity of her own marriage. The practical effect of this letter was threefold. It confirmed officially that Thomas Vane's Nevada marriage was bigamous. It initiated a legal process that would likely result in that marriage being annulled, and it placed Nora Vane's situation in the formal legal record as abandoned wife rather than deserting wife, which was a distinction that mattered enormously in 1880s territorial law. Sheriff Bowl brought this letter to Nora personally, with a formality that suggested he understood it as a kind of reparation for the discomfort of his earlier visit. Nora read it at the kitchen table, with Gideon standing at the window and the girls at school. When she finished, she set it down and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Clara Bette did this," Gideon said, "apparently." Nora said, "She never met me and she did this." He said, "Some people are clear about what's right even when it costs them something." Nora looked out the window at the February mountain. She said, "I should write to her." He said, "Yes." She did. The letter she wrote to Clara Bette Vane was 2 pages long, and she never shared its contents with anyone. But she cried while she wrote it, quietly, with her back to the room. The town meeting happened on the 3rd Saturday of February, called officially to discuss the spring road maintenance budget, and attended by most of the adult population of Greystone Pass, for reasons that had nothing to do with road maintenance. It was the first time Gideon and Nora had appeared in a public setting together with the implicit understanding of together, rather than simply both present, and the town registered this with the particular social alertness of a community that has been waiting to take a position and needed a visible moment to take it. The meeting was chaired by Mayor Webb, and the road budget was discussed for exactly 12 minutes before Aldous Prigg raised the matter of the Vane account's outstanding $80 as an item of community financial governance. The room went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when everyone is paying very close attention while pretending to be merely present. Gideon, seated beside Nora in the 3rd row, did not move or speak. Nora, who had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to everything since Thomas left, reached into her coat and produced $1.80 in exact coin and placed it on the table in front of her. She said, "Account settled." The room's quality of silence changed, from holding breath to something that was almost the release of it. Prigg looked at the coins. He looked at Nora. His face did what it always did, absolutely nothing visible. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Vane." He sat down, and Greystone Pass which had been waiting to decide something about Aldous Prigg for a very long time, decided it in that moment, quietly and without declaration, the way mountain weather decides. Wren was asleep when Nora came home from the town meeting, but Cass was sitting up in bed with the patience of a 4-year-old who has decided that sleep is less important than information. She asked, "Did it go right?" Nora sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed Cass's hair and said, "Yes." Cass said, "Did Gideon help?" Nora said, "He did." Cass considered this. She said, "I like him." Nora said, "I know." Cass said, "Do you?" Nora was quiet for a moment. The February wind moved against the window, cold and purposeful, the kind of wind that reminds you of the mountain's indifference and makes the warmth inside feel like something that must be actively maintained. She looked at her smaller daughter's face, 4 years old, direct as a nail, her father's stubborn, chin and Nora's own brown eyes looking up at her in the lamplight. She thought about the question, which was not the simple question it appeared to be. She thought about what it cost to let something in after you had spent years learning to keep things at the perimeter. She thought about an elk-hide coat and grey mountain eyes, and a voice like cold gravel that asked how much without asking why. She said, "Yes, Cass, I like him." Cass nodded with the satisfaction of a child whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "Good," she said, and lay back down and closed her eyes. Nora sat there a little longer in the quiet house, listening to the wind, feeling the warmth of the repaired roof above her, holding the coin purse now lighter by $1.80, thinking about what it felt like when the things that have been pressing on you from all sides finally begin to lift. What Prigg did next was not what anyone expected, because Prigg was smart enough to know that direct. Confrontation with a man like Gideon Delt on Delt's terms was a losing position. What he did instead was more characteristic and considerably more dangerous. He called in every significant debt in Greystone Pass simultaneously, not to threaten or to collect, not immediately, but to remind. Letters went out in the last week of February to every household carrying a balance at the store, noting the current amount, the terms, and the annual review date. The letters were polite and formal, and completely legal, and their effect on the community was a kind of financial cold front, a sudden drop in temperature that everyone felt, but that no one could point to as hostile, because it was simply business, simply accounting, simply the normal operation of a commercial establishment. People who had been shifting quietly away from Prigg shifted quietly back. People who had been thinking about speaking up thought again about the arithmetic of speaking up. The Dr. Fells, who had offered to be a character witness, received a letter noting that his account had been carrying an outstanding balance since October, and that Prigg looked forward to discussing a resolution. Harlan Cross received a letter about his livery supply account. Even Mayor Webb received a letter about the council's facility maintenance supplies. It was a masterwork of indirect pressure, a reminder issued to the entire community simultaneously that Aldous Prigg's patience was not the same thing as Aldous Prigg's weakness. Gideon read the situation clearly because he had been reading terrain his entire life, and what Prigg had created was a form of terrain, a landscape of mutual dependency and fear in which the person who controlled the supply controlled the direction. He spent 2 days thinking about it, not planning exactly. He was past the stage of planning moves against Prigg as an individual. He was thinking about the structure. The structure was Prigg's power, and the structure was the store's monopoly. And the monopoly existed because the 40 miles of mountain road between Greystone Pass and the next town made resupply from elsewhere logistically difficult enough that most people never attempted it. He thought about this the way he thought about a blocked mountain trail. Not with frustration, but with the practical question of whether the blockage was permanent or whether there was a line around it that hadn't been tried. He thought about his 20 years of trail knowledge in the range country between Greystone Pass and the supply towns to the east. He thought about the secondary route through Cutter's Gap, the one that added 12 miles to the journey, but avoided the main pass entirely, and was, in his experience, passable by a loaded wagon from mid-April through late October. He thought about what it would mean for the town if there were a second supply route. He thought about this for 2 days. Then he went to see Mayor Webb. Webb was, as Gideon had assessed him, a reasonable man within the limits of his self-interest, and what Gideon put to him was a proposal that aligned with Webb's self-interest in ways that made his reasonableness easy to access. A mapped and documented secondary supply route through Cutter's Gap, Gideon explained, would reduce the town's logistical dependence on the main pass. It would enable supply contracts with merchants in the eastern towns, creating commercial competition that would naturally stabilize the prices of goods currently held at whatever level the sole local supplier chose to set. It would, in aggregate, make Greystone Pass more resilient and less economically vulnerable to any single point of failure. He did not mention Prigg by name. He did not need to. Webb looked at the rough map Gideon had drawn from memory. Clean, accurate lines, the route marked in red, distances noted, seasonal availability indicated, with the expression of a man seeing something he had not known to want, and now found he wanted considerably. He said, "Could you do it? Document the route formally." Gideon said, "I've been doing it in my head for 15 years. Putting it on paper is a week's work in good weather." Webb said, "Spring is 6 weeks out." Gideon said, "I'll be ready." They shook hands. Webb looked at the map again after Gideon left, tracing the red line with his finger, thinking about what it would mean. What it would mean was that Greystone Pass had an exit, a real one, documented and passable, from the closed system it had been living inside. What it would mean for Aldous Prigg was a question Webb thought about carefully, and with something that felt surprisingly like satisfaction. Prigg found out about the map proposal through his channels on a Friday, and this time his composure showed its first real crack, not in his face, not in his words, but in a single physical tell that the clerk Finch later described to Harlan Cross. Prigg's right hand, holding a supply ledger, went still for exactly 3 seconds when Finch mentioned what the mayor had said in the records office. Just 3 seconds of stillness, where there should have been the normal, rhythmic motion of page turning. Then it resumed. 3 seconds in a man as controlled as Prigg was the equivalent of another man throwing something across the room. He understood immediately what the map meant. It meant that every pressure he had applied, the debts, the letters, the social maneuvering, the 22-year ledger entry, had been operating on the assumption of the town's captivity, and that captivity was the actual foundation of his power, and that Gideon Delt had identified this foundation and was moving to remove it, not through legal challenge or social confrontation, but through the simplest possible instrument. A road. A road that Prigg could not own, could not ledger, could not threaten away, because roads belonged to the terrain, and the terrain was the one thing in Greystone Pass that had never been, and could never be, entered in any man's account book. He sat with this for a long time that Friday evening, alone in his store after closing, the ledgers open in front of him. For the first time in 22 years of careful management, Aldous Prigg could not see his next move. Nora did not know about the map until Gideon told her himself on a March evening, when the snow was beginning, the first tentative retreat from the lower elevations, and the smell of the mountain air had changed from the iron cold of deep winter to something carrying the first suggestion of water and pine and the green that was still weeks away but was already preparing to arrive. He told her simply and completely, the way he told her everything, the route, the meeting with Webb, what it would mean for the town's commercial independence, the timeline. She listened. When he finished, she said, "You did this for the town." He said, "I did it because it makes sense." She said, "You did it for the town." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "And for you." It was the first explicitly personal thing he had said to her in 4 months of presence, 4 months of useful work and careful proximity, and the slow construction of something neither of them had named. She received it the way she received most things, without ceremony, without performance, with a steadiness that was not coldness, but its exact opposite, the steadiness of a person who has decided to be fully present to something rather than managing it at a careful distance. She said, "Then I'll tell you something for you." She told him about the tin box, about all of it. Thomas, the Nevada letter, the legal ambiguity, the weight she had been carrying. Not because she needed rescuing from any of it. Most of it was already resolved. But because she was tired of carrying things alone, and because he had told her something true, and the only honest response to a true thing is another true thing. March arrived, and with it the first serious thaw, and with the thaw came movement in a mountain town that had been locked still for 4 months, supplies moving, people moving, decisions that had been held in suspension by the cold now requiring action. Gideon began the formal documentation of the Cutter's Gap route the first week of March, working in the mountain mornings with the methodical precision of a man who has been doing this work for 20 years and knows exactly how to translate terrain into information that a loaded wagon driver can use. He was 3 days into it when Prigg made his last move. It was not the move anyone expected, because the move anyone expected was another pressure on another debt, another letter, another quiet instrument applied with patient precision. What Prigg did instead was go to the 2 ranchers east of town who controlled the pasture land on either side of the trailhead that led to Cutter's Gap, men named Orry Steen and Caldwell Marsh, and he called in the loans he had been carrying on both operations for the past 6 years, not partially, in full, within 30 days. The loans totaled $90, which neither Orry nor Caldwell had in liquid form, and the collateral on both loans included the pasture land itself. If the loans were not settled, Prigg would legally acquire the land, and the land included the only access point to the Cutter's Gap trailhead. It was a precise, devastating move, the kind that is only possible when a man has been playing the long game for long enough to have pieces positioned where no one thought to look. He had effectively bought a door and was threatening to lock it before the road could be finished. Gideon came back from the mountains that evening to find Orry Steen sitting on the livery step, hat in his hands, with the look of a man who has just had the ground removed from under him. Orry told him about the lone calls in the flat, stunned voice of someone who has been hit and hasn't, yet decided whether to fall. Gideon listened to the full account without interrupting. Then he asked for the exact figures and the exact terms. Then he sat quietly for a long moment in the livery's lamp-lit doorway, looking at the mountains, turning the situation in his mind with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. The numbers were large. $90 was a very large sum by any standard in Greystone Pass. He had resources, 20 years of trapping and guiding, carefully held, spent against only what was necessary, but not unlimited ones, and the lease on Nora's property and the cleared debts had already made withdrawals. He thought about the road. He thought about what the road meant, not as an abstraction about commercial independence, but in its concrete, immediate form. 18 family farms and 300 people in a mountain town who had been, for 20 years, at the mercy of one man's willingness to be fair. He thought about Nora and her daughters and a loaf of bread taken in desperation and set back on a shelf by a man who confused possession with right. He thought about Wren's face in the livery doorway, holding that note, 7 years old and already doing the math. He made his decision the way he made most decisions, by running the calculation to its end and then acting on the result without unnecessary delay. He went to see Fells the doctor first, because Fells was the person in Greystone Pass he trusted most after Nora, and because the problem was too large for one man's resources, even if those resources were sufficient, and because there was something he needed to know before he committed to a course of action. Fells listened to the account of Prigg's move with the careful attention of someone hearing a diagnosis. Then he said, "How much do you have?" Gideon told him. Fells said, "I have 40. I've been keeping it for 20 years for exactly this kind of situation, and this is exactly this kind of situation." He said it with the calm of someone who has rehearsed a decision so many times in their mind that its arrival in reality feels like a confirmation rather than a surprise. Then Gideon went to Harlan Cross. Harlan said, "I have 15. Take it." Then Webb. Then a rancher named Doris Teal on the North Pasture, who had her own history with Prigg's ledger and who looked at Gideon for exactly 3 seconds before she said, 20. When do you need it? By midnight he had enough. Not comfortably enough. Exactly enough, with $12 remaining, which was a margin he would have preferred to be larger, but which was the margin available, and therefore the margin he worked with. He spent the rest of the night writing letters. To Oristine, to Caldwell Marsh, to Prigg himself, to Sheriff Bowl, to Mayor Webb, to the Territorial Land Office. By 3 in the morning, the letters were written and the funds were accounted for, and his hand ached from the writing, but the architecture of the response was complete in a way that left no openings. He delivered the funds to Prigg's store at 7 in the morning, before the store opened, $90 in coin and bills, exact, in a canvas pouch set on the door, with a note listing the loan accounts being settled and the names of the contributors. He did not wait for a response. He went directly from Prigg's door to the trailhead at Cutter's Gap and resumed his documentation work, moving up the mountain in the early spring morning, with his surveying tools and his maps, the cold air carrying the smell of snowmelt and pine resin, the peaks above him catching the first light. He worked until noon. He ate lunch on a rock above the tree line, with the whole valley spread below him. Greystone Pass, visible as a cluster of brown rooftops and wood smoke in the white basin, small and precise as a map of itself. He thought about the $90. He thought about Fells saying, "I have 40. I've been keeping it for 20 years. He thought about Harlan Cross saying, "Take it." He thought about Doris Teal and her 3-second decision. He had lived alone for 20 years on the premise that self-sufficiency was not just practical, but morally preferable, that needing nothing from anyone was the only clean way to move through the world. He sat on his rock above the tree line and felt the particular discomfort of a premise being revised, and he let the revision happen without fighting it. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work, because the road still needed mapping, and it wasn't going to map itself. Prigg opened the canvas pouch at 7:15, standing in the back room of his store in the grey morning light. He counted the money twice. He read the note. He set both down on his work table and stood for a long moment. Outside, Greystone Pass was waking up. A horse on the main street, someone's door, the smell of wood smoke from the bakery 2 streets over. He had built this town, in a sense, not its buildings or its families, but the web of dependency that ran through it like the structural members of a wall, invisible when intact, obvious only when something put pressure on them. He had believed, without ever examining the belief, that this web was permanent, that it was the natural condition of a mountain town to need one man's patience and one man's store and one man's careful memory of what was owed. He picked up the money. He put it in his strong box. He opened the ledger to the pages for Orry Stain and Caldwell Marsh and drew a clean line through the balances with his precise commercial hand. Then he turned to the pages for every other account in the town, all of them, one by one, and he looked at each balance and each name and the date of each entry. He was there for a very long time. When he came out to open the store at his regular hour, something in his posture had changed. Not broken, not collapsed, but altered, the way a structure alters when one of its load-bearing assumptions has been removed. He opened the store. He served his customers. He was courteous and precise, but something in the ledger room behind him was different, and everyone who came into the store that day felt it without being able to name it. The weight had shifted, and in Greystone Pass, which had been living under that weight for 22 years, the shift was felt in the chest, like the first deep breath of spring. The road through Cutter's Gap was formally documented and presented to Mayor Webb and the town council in the 2nd week of April, when the last of the serious snow had retreated to the upper elevations and the lower mountain was running with meltwater, and green was beginning its annual argument with the brown. The document was 31 pages, maps, elevation profiles, seasonal passage conditions, recommended wagon configurations, distance and time calculations, a guide to the 6 water sources along the route, and a brief appendix on the 3. Weather conditions that would make the route inadvisable, and how to read them from the valley floor. Webb received it with the expression of a man being handed something that has arrived exactly when it was needed. He called a town meeting the following Sunday, and at that meeting, Gideon Delt stood up in front of 300 people, which was, for a man who had spent 20 years in country where the nearest person was often measured in miles rather than yards, a somewhat extraordinary experience, and he explained the route in plain language without drama or embellishment. When he finished, there was a silence, and then the kind of sound a group of people makes when they have been holding something for a long time and have been given permission to set it down. The road through Cutter's Gap was approved unanimously. The town committed to its maintenance in the spring and fall work parties. A supply agreement with a merchant in the eastern town of Harlan's Crossing was drafted within the week. Aldous Prigg didn't attend the town meeting. He did not attend because he had calculated that attendance would require him to either oppose the route publicly, which would reveal the full shape of his interest, or support it in the presence of people who now understood his interest, which would be a performance of graciousness he had not yet mastered. He stayed in his store and kept his books and served his customers. What happened to Prigg over the following months was not dramatic. He was not run out of town. He was not publicly condemned. He was not even significantly boycotted. His store was still the most conveniently located supply point in Greystone Pass, and people used it because people use what is convenient. But the relationship between Aldous Prigg and Greystone Pass changed in the specific way that the relationship between a person and a power changes when the power is no longer absolute. It became optional. People still came to his store, but they came because they chose to, not because they had no other choice. And the difference between those two things was the entire weight of everything he had built. He felt it every day in the slightly different quality of the transactions, the absence of the particular deference that comes from captivity, the subtle equalization of a relationship that had been, for 20 years, comprehensively unequal. He kept his ledger. He remained precise. He was, in the language of the town's charitable interpretation, simply a businessman in a more competitive environment. In the language of what had actually happened, he was a man who had been living on borrowed power and had been handed the bill. The question of Gideon Delt staying in Greystone Pass resolved itself not through a dramatic declaration, but through the accumulation of small, practical facts that together added up to a life. He repaired the lean-to behind Nora's house, in April, which had been structurally questionable since before his arrival. He built a proper woodshed in May. He accepted a contract from the town council to serve as the official guide for the Cutter's Gap route during its first commercial season, which required him to be in Greystone Pass rather than the high country for the summer months, which meant he needed better quarters than the livery, which meant Harlan Cross offered him the use of the small room above the stable for a reasonable monthly rate, which Gideon accepted, and which placed him 2 streets from Nora's house in a proximity that was practical and daily, and that both of them treated as simply the arrangement that made sense, given the circumstances. The town observed this with the combination of awareness and discretion that communities develop for situations they approve of and don't want to jinx by naming. Mrs. Callum said nothing to anyone. Fells said nothing. Harlan Cross said to Gideon, very directly, "You know you could just live there." And Gideon said, "Yes." And Harlan said, "All right then." And they went back to discussing the spring supply schedule, which was the conversation they had been having before Harlan raised the other subject, and neither of them mentioned it again. Nora asked him one evening in June, when the mountain air was warm for the first time, and the kitchen window was open, and Wren was doing mathematics at the table, and Cass was asleep, and the smell of pine and creek water came in through the window and mixed with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, in the quiet and easy way that people ask things when the asking has become easier than not asking. "Are you going back to the high country?" He thought about it. The high country had been his answer to everything for 20 years. Its silence, its indifference, its clean remove from the complications of a life lived among people. He thought about what it had given him, and what it had cost him, and whether the accounting still balanced the way it once had. He said, "In the fall, for the trapping season." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then back." She looked at him across the kitchen, this woman who had held her chin level in a doorway and her hands steady on a counter, and her daughters fed through a winter that had been designed to break her. And she said, "That's enough." He said, "Yes." The window was open. The mountain was visible in the last light, white at the peaks, still and green and brown below, enormous and permanent and there, the way it had always been and would always be, indifferent to the small particular warmth of a kitchen at the top of a hill in a mountain town where something had changed forever. The town of Greystone Pass told the story of Gideon Delt and Nora Vane for a generation, adding details at each retelling and losing others, but always keeping the shape of it intact, because the shape of it was the kind of shape that holds. A woman with 2 daughters and a loaf of bread and a chin that didn't drop, and a man who asked how much without asking why, and a town that had been living inside a closed system until one morning in November on the cold street outside a general store. 2 people who had each learned to ask only what was necessary found themselves briefly in the same sentence and understood, in the way that precise people understand things, that the calculation of this was worth running to its end. Wren Vane grew up to study law, which surprised no one who had known her at 7. Cass grew up to be exactly what Cass at 4 had promised: direct, certain, and right about most things. Old Finch, the records clerk, retired and left his meticulous county files to the Historical Society, who found in them a comprehensive record of everything that had happened in Greystone Pass, including the ledger dispute and the land office ruling and the formation of the Cutter's Gap supply route, all of it in the same neat hand, impartial and complete. Aldous Prigg ran his store for another 12 years, competently and without incident, which was the ending he deserved and received. And on a spring morning the following year, in the church behind the main street, with the blue bonnets thick along the road, and the mountains white at the peaks, and the whole valley running with green and water, Gideon Delt and Nora Vane stood before a preacher and 2 daughters and 300 people who had been waiting for this specific Sunday for quite some time, and made the kind of promises that people make when they have been tested by everything and found each other worth the arithmetic.